I'm now going to move straight on to introducing our fantastic speaker today. Thrilled to have him here. He's a friend as well as a brilliant PR expert in the field. And John Brown is the founder and CEO of brand activist agency Don't Cry Wolf. I'm sure you've seen him on Twitter. If you haven't, give him a follow, and Don't Cry Wolf too. One of their most recent campaigns has rewritten diverse fairy tales for Tangled Teaser, again worth a look. And last summer, its Protect Pongo Street art campaign highlighted the issue of palm oil deforestation for Meridian Foods. So all really big topics that needed to be treated with care. Now, John and his team are passionate advocates of the B Corp movement. And they're I think one of the very first, if not the first, to get it in the PR industry. Don't Cry Wolf last week also moved to report on its carbon usage. So, you know, big move to make, and one that I would hope other agencies and in-house teams will look to follow. Also, just very recently, it's taken the radical step of appointing a client to its board. So big things, doing things differently. So really glad to have John here today. John, I'm going to hand over to you and you can tell everybody about the work that you're now doing with PRCA on misinformation and climate change, please.
Cool. Thank you. Wow, what a delightful little introduction. That's yeah, it's great to be a part of this, and thank you for having me along. As Sarah said, yeah, I head up Don't Cry Wolf, and one of the things that we tried to do when we started back in January 2018 was see whether we could kind of build a PR agency that grew, that, you know, was able to make a profit, but as we grew, the wider world benefited a little bit. So one of the things that I'm obviously very passionate about is around sustainability and seeing how businesses in particular can work together to address some of society's biggest issues, which is kind of what brand activism is, to be honest with you, at its core, which is seeing how you can utilize the power of a brand or a collective of brands to address a societal issue, either from a sort of policy perspective or even from a social perspective as well. As we all know, we are in the year, finally, I guess, hopefully, we'll see what happens, of COP26. It's being hosted very close by in Glasgow. And it kind of, one of the key areas that we wanted to sort of try and understand was what role does communications play within this sort of climate crisis discussion, climate crisis debate. And obviously the area or the topic that sort of we kind of wanted to readdress was misinformation, or is misinformation. So after a few chin wags with dear old Francis and a few other people, we thought that we'd put together a little working group. And I know a new working group in the PRCA gets spun up every 36 seconds, but this one was quite focused in terms of its objectives, right? Which is, firstly, see whether we can get on the agenda of COP to talk about misinformation. Secondly, to try and work out what's going wrong in this discussion. And I'm going to give both sides of the fence as well, because I think there's a tendency to think I'm talking about misinformation, the climate crisis, you know, I'm wearing a Patagonia hat, so it must be that I'm going to take the position that, you know, all climate deniers spread misinformation, and everyone else who's on the other side of the fence, they're all the truth sayers. Well, actually, it's not. And that's one of the things that this working group is looking at, because there is fear on both sides of the fence. So looking at misinformation holistically and trying to work out, A, where's the public gap in the knowledge, and how to help just to touch the members of the public, spot it, kind of challenge information, and take an approach on sort of critical thinking. But then importantly, how we can more empower public relations professionals and communicators to try and navigate this slightly murky, at times very aggressive world, so that they feel confident enough to A, share the really positive stuff that's going on, B, kind of call bullshit on the slightly flaky stuff that's going on, and C, collectively work together so that they can actually share information, ideas, and case studies that will all lead to what we hope will be better positive action in this space. So that's the sort of the approach that, or the focus that this working group has. We just commissioned some research that's being undertaken by Census-Wide. Is it Census-Wide? No, it's not, is it? I don't know. One of the survey organisations. I'll get in trouble for that. And the link will be shared on the channel later. Do take a look and get involved in that survey, because we need to first understand what the problem is and where that exists, and then look at how we can try and address some of those issues. But today, I guess what I wanted to try and do was give you guys a bit of a grounding in this, in my mind, as to what the issue is and why I think genuinely that we have some responsibility to bear on the topic of misinformation and the climate crisis. It's opinion, isn't it? It was opinion. That's the survey, people. Sorry, opinion. You guys are lovely. Thank you for doing this for us. Right, let me have a look at whether this tech works. Can you all see this? And if you can hear noise in the background, it's because my kids have decided that right now they're going to print out all of their homework. So bear with that. There you go. Hopefully you can see the presentation. Yeah, all good? Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So a few things. Let's start with some definitions, because that's always fun and enjoyable. First and foremost, what do I mean by misinformation? So I mean the spread of false information regardless of intent to deceive. I think that's really important to highlight. So misinformation and disinformation are different things. Misinformation is this idea of that false information is spreading, but that might be as a result of ignorance, naivety, just the sort of the social dynamics of what we're seeing on social media play out. There might not necessarily be an intent to deceive someone with that. Whereas disinformation has kind of an intent to deceive, like it's being done on purpose to either sway opinion or to point people in potentially a false direction. So when I talk about misinformation, it is the wider kind of topic of spreading false information regardless of the intent to deceive. When I talk about the climate crisis, what do I mean? It's the imminent threat of a highly dangerous, irreversible changes to the global climate due to man-made damage. That's my take on when I say the climate crisis, this is what I believe it to be, and what I believe the definition to be. And when I talk about comms professionals, I mean anyone being paid to provide communications advice. That's it. Anyone, whether you're working at an organization, at an agency, in government, a third sector, whatever it might be. Anyone who's actually being paid to provide comms advice or consultancy. Everyone happy with those definitions, or certainly my definitions? If you're not happy with them, you can write your own. I'm just going to set the context and set the scene around this. So misinformation fuels both denial and alarmism. And I want to make this absolutely crystal clear. In fact, there was a research study done. There's going to be links throughout this presentation. I'm very happy for it to be shared with others as well, to sources where I've kind of picked up some information, some data, hopefully well-recognized sources as well. Otherwise, that would be a real shot in the foot. Misinformation happens on both sides of this debate. And I think it's absolutely critical to understand that, firstly, because it is easy, and actually, frankly, it's a bit lazy to park it at the feet of one side or another. So to say, well, actually, it's climate change deniers that spread misinformation. It's lazy, and actually, it's pensively not true. Equally, to say, well, actually, it's all the fault of climate alarmists, and it's Greta Thunberg's fault that misinformation is being spread around the world, is equally not true when it comes to the climate crisis topic. There is responsibility on both sides, and it's penetrating both sides' psyche. And it's important that we understand this, that we bring some initial balance and open-mindedness to the debate, rather than immediately lurch for one throat or another. It's actually useful to first take a step back and to start thinking, okay, well, where does this information come from? And is it credible, irrespective of whether I love that person who's saying it or not? Because it happens on both sides. Secondly, things are a little bit shit if we look at what's happening in in terms of the targets that were set at the Paris Climate Agreement, and this UN target of remaining below 2 degrees of warming. Currently, and this is from a fairly recent peer-reviewed report that was shared in Nature, we have about a 5% chance of hitting that target. About a 5% chance of hitting that target. Now, what I'm not going to do is spend an awful lot of time at all talking about what happens if we go above this degrees of warming and talking about any sort of catastrophes and things such as that. You'll hear throughout this a common theme, which is there are books written, journals published every week around this topic, and you should seek out that information and make that kind of decision for yourself. But needless to say, there is a fair amount for me evidence that suggests that it would be useful if we limited the amount of global warming that takes place, and ideally get below that 2 degrees of warming. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be on track, which is as much a failure of the agreement in itself as it is for the wider society, and misinformation in providing a platform for this not to be hit. So there's as much a complexity of what's happening with the Paris Climate Agreement, what's happening in global politics, as it is around the fault of misinformation causing an upset in reaching these targets. Intent versus action. I think this is, I'm not sourced this because it's just kind of a little rant from me, to be honest with you. But I think this is where we start getting into the comms territory a bit, which is declaring a climate emergency is not the same as addressing it. And I really want to be clear about this. So people and brands and communicators were breathlessly falling over themselves to sign up to any potential list that exists out there in the wider world that says, we declare a climate emergency. Well, I mean, that's fantastic. But what the fuck are you going to do about it? That's the big question, because declaring a climate emergency, declaring intent is great. What I want to see is proof around what you're actually going to do and what that genuinely means to you as an organization, as a communicator, as a professional, as a government, as an industry. Because declaration without action is completely pointless. And I think this needs to start penetrating the minds of all of our communicators, which is we are beyond the stage of declarations now. We are beyond the stage of big sort of grand gestures. We are at the point where we have to put things forward into action and proof and transparency in order to start making progress. So if you are sat there in the boardroom of any organization or at your agency or wherever it might be, and you're all debating as to which climate list you are going to sign up to, like, that has absolutely no weight anymore. Instead, work out what you're going to actually functionally do as a business, understand what your current problem is, and then start addressing it. And you can create whatever campaign off the back of that you want. But simply saying, we believe this, is not good enough anymore. Potentially a fairly controversial statement around this, but I don't know, I just say the body of evidence is building. There has been a very recent report or review completed, totally accessible on the government's website. There's a link here called the That's Good review that focuses on the impact on our natural environment as a result of economic growth. Fundamentally, if we're going to address some of these core issues that is facing us in terms of a climate crisis or a climate change threat, we have to go about a conscious decoupling. I think the last big conscious decoupling was Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin, but now we need to have a conscious decoupling between GDP growth and economic growth and the cost on the natural environment. I think this is quite a startling statistic from the Dasgupta review, which was, human capital per person increased by about 13% globally over the course of this review. But the stock of natural capital per person declined by nearly 40%. And natural capital, the natural environment, the wider world that we need to actually exist, declining in favor of GDP is a problem. It requires looking at in intensity, irrespective of whether you sit on whichever side of the fence. It's important that this actually has an investigation and is thoroughly looked into, and that we work out a different framework for trying to understand, well, what is the actual cost of this growth? What I think is fascinating when you start dipping into this is that, let's say, carbon emissions, for example, aren't accounted for at all. There's not a cost to that. If you were to, I suppose, bring together the cost of creating the iPhone 12, and there's some fascinating stats around this, I think it currently sort of retails at around, I don't know, 600, 800 quid, something like that, 900 quid. You would actually get closer if with bringing into account the cost on natural resources for mining, for the creation, for the disposal of the product, perhaps throw in there some child labor as well. And what you'll get is a cost closer to 9.5 grand than you would an 800 quid product. Now, this is a interesting kind of review and an interesting way of interpreting the genuine cost. And actually, this is one of the problems that's facing some of the other areas, such as offsetting, which is that there's no genuine, real kind of likely cost associated with carbon credits. You're talking about dollars, like literally less than $10 to offset a sort of ton of emissions, when actually the sort of the figure should be far closer to the hundreds of dollars rather than the tens of dollars. So we need to work out a way in which we can pursue economic growth. Absolutely, there needs to be a focus on how we can still maintain growth in society, make sure that the wealth in society is evenly spread and it's growing in a sustainable manner, but also understanding deeply what the cost on our natural environment is as well. And one of the things that I think as communicators we should be aware of is that it's magnificent to report on fantastic figures of profit and growth in businesses and to talk about new product releases. I would love to see that alongside an identification of what that actually cost the planet as well. So in terms of the actual roles of communicators as a whole and in this debate, I kind of brought it down into sort of 4 key areas. So number 1, the energizer. So this is one role which I think communicators can adopt. So, and that's about influencing stakeholders to get energized and motivated around addressing the climate crisis in the right way. So in this sense, it's about raising the issue at a high level. It's about influencing the right stakeholders across the business to see what impact can be made into addressing some of the certain issues. Now, I don't mean wholeheartedly going after big ballsy targets. Instead, it would be looking at how can we genuinely make change? How can we genuinely influence and impact something in our own world first before we start madly campaigning about it, and get people excited by that? Share some good news stories of other organizations doing the same. But importantly, it's about looking at which people to get involved in the organization. We're communicators, we're influencers. We should be on the hunt and looking for different people across an organization, whether that's an agency or a business or a governmental body, to understand who do we need to influence and get excited about this? What content and information and stats and examples do they need to get them on board, to get them energized around this? So I think it's an incredibly important role for communicators to be acting as this energizer of the business around these sorts of topics. The other role is the sage. Okay, we talk about consultancy until we're blue in the face. We talk about how we should be approached as consultants and never as a sort of transactional relationship. Well, we need to be the finger on the pulse of this topic then. I think what worries me right now, and this is one of the areas that we're trying to understand with the working group and the research that we're producing, is how much of our knowledge as an industry is superficial. How much of the information and the data that we're collecting is based on other people's headlines rather than genuinely looking at the science, the data, the facts, and also reading around the topics that might argue against what your thought position is as well. So it's important for us as communicators that we have a far deeper knowledge, a far deeper understanding of this climate crisis debate and this topic that goes beyond superficial headlines and into the actual information itself, so that when someone puts forward a suggestion, asks a question, comes up with a campaign idea or a red thread or a strap line, you're able to consult from a position of authority and knowledge rather than superficial headlines. The coach. I think this is really important as a role that a communicator can play. I'm worried that there have been an awful lot of campaigns launched over recent years addressing the issue of climate or sustainability or the climate crisis as a whole. And that's where they've stopped. The campaigns existed. Everyone's given themselves an awful big pat on the back for addressing something in the wider papers. There's maybe an award thrown around left, right, and centre. But then we move on. We move on to the next big thing. We move on to another topic or our next campaign. In actual fact, as a coach, and to sort of personify this coach archetype for the comms professional, it's about looking at the commitment that was made and making sure that that action continues through. Why? Because I can tell you now, guys, in a couple of years' time or less than 12 months' time, someone's going to pick up on that campaign that you made that huge commitment on and ask for evidence. And if you can't provide it, you've shot yourself in the foot as a brand and as a professional as well. So making sure that you're coaching an organization to take these steps, to keep moving forward with this action is absolutely critical. The final role is the critic, and it's a really important role to play. I worry that sometimes that we are an industry, saying yes an awful lot of time, and yes is perhaps our most valuable word, because what we're offering is our knowledge, our expertise, our experience, our consultation. So when we say yes all the time, it's almost signaling that we're constantly committed to something. Actually, it's important to first investigate, and if appropriate, to say no, to call bullshit on it, to look at something and actually critically analyze whether this is just being viewed from the perspective of business gain from the communications world, or whether there is a genuine thread of intent and action to address a climate crisis issue. And where you see it, you need to call it out. Now, I don't mean all go around and start poking around other people's campaigns and telling everyone how shit they are. But I do mean that it's important when you're at that moment in time, and we've all been there, where an idea or a concept, a campaign or a request has been put forward, and there's that slight gut feel that this needs deeper exploration. It's important that you say, pause. We need to review this first. We don't want to be caught calling bullshit all the time. So if those are the roles that we can play, which I think are incredibly powerful roles, right? You've got one which is trying to really energize the business and move them forward. You've got a role of a sort of a sage, a knowledge, a fountain of knowledge, a kind of consultant coming forward and being that sort of that individual that can provide the insight, the deep insight to this issue. You've got the critic, which is obviously calling time on bullshit. And then you've got this coach role, which is trying to keep people moving forward, keep them honest to the actions that they've committed to. There is a problem. To assume these roles, you need three things: confidence, clarity, and commitment. And that will give you positive action. That will give you the opportunity for positive action. But instead, what we have is fear, confusion, and recklessness. And that's where misinformation is born out of. And that's how we are ultimately ending up contributing to this sort of perpetual cycle of misinformation. It's because we don't have the confidence, and instead we're slightly wary, we're slightly living in fear. And yes, despite me being, I suppose to most people, some sort of weird and wonderful bearded climate activist in some way, NGOs, big celebrities in this debate have something to answer for in creating a climate of fear around positive change, 100%. And we need to acknowledge that as well. Clarity, working out where to find these sources of information and having a real clear understanding of a topic is important. But right now I feel as though we're leading into an area of confusion. And then commitment, rather than going around the superficial statements of intent, actually moving forward with action. And instead what we have is a climate of recklessness, where we're trying to out-campaign each other and make big statements, lavish statements that get enshrined in gold in our industry publications, where in actual fact, it's not doing anything to move the debate along or move action forward. And this creates this misinformation climate. So how can we become aware of our own misinformation? And what are the key trends that I think I'm seeing that, I worry about and that I think we need to address within this industry? Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of this. It's just a soft drink, it's not beer yet. That's at 2 o'clock. Right, net zero washing. It's the first area which I want to address. So net zero commitments doubled in less than a year. Lots of organizations coming out and committing to net zero. Thing is, it's quite easy to commit to something when it's 30 years ahead. I don't know, it doesn't feel as though there's an awful lot of barriers to entry to say, in 30 years' time, we're going to be net zero. I mean, in 30 years' time, I think, I'll probably be on a Tahitian island somewhere, wrapped up in seaweed and smoking an enormous cigar. You're not going to be held accountable as such individually in 30 years' time for some of these commitments. And what I think worries me is that there's this huge burst of net zero commitments being made by businesses, spurred on by big PR campaigns, and yet only 8% of those organizations have actually provided interim results. So there's no proof behind that pudding yet. If you're making a net zero commitment, and I urge you to do so, I urge you to explore it and take a look. If you genuinely believe you can hit a net zero target as an organization, and you truly understand what a net zero target means, then you should absolutely explore it. But have the fortitude to report on it on a yearly basis. Have the courage to say, there's going to be some years where we get it wrong. Don't always think that this is going to be a complete downward trajectory to net zero. It's not. That's not how humanity works as well. And I think this is deeply important to understand. Making that net zero washing commitment and that statement sends out this signal that every organization can do this, which I suppose they can, right? They can sign up to a net zero commitment online. They just have to fill out a form. But actually doing it, reporting on it, that's the positive action that we need to see replicated. That's what we should be suggesting to our clients and to our bosses and to our government ministers. Those are the commitments that actually matter. And we're not seeing that come through yet. Offsetting. What a big old topic this is. So not all offsetting is equal. There's a fascinating case study around the sort of the airline industry or the aviation industry, the commercial airline industry, and these offsetting schemes, which they are paying a drastically small amount of money towards. It is important that when you look at offsetting, it is actually part and parcel of a reduction, reuse, and offset plan. So ultimately, you should be reducing the footprint you have, reusing elements of your supply chain, and what you can't reduce or reuse, you then offset. And then when you come to offset, you look at the absolute solid gold schemes that exist out there, and they cost more, by the way, guys. Like anything that's worth investing in, it tends to cost a touch more. But this is the crucial thing. Don't be afraid to talk about it. I think a lot of organizations have done some extraordinary work in the offsetting area. And they're afraid to talk about it because there are very, very vocal NGOs, very, very vocal individuals who rubbish offsetting in its entirety, which is complete nonsense. And it's actually shooting ourselves in the foot a touch, because I tell you what, I would love the billions and billions of the airline industry to go up a notch and to be invested in renewable energy and good offsetting schemes. And that will make a damn sight bigger impact than if Don't Cry Wolf decided to run an offsetting scheme. So poo-pooing it in the media and then creating a climate of fear for communicators saying, well, we probably shouldn't talk too much about offsetting, irritates me. It shouldn't be like that. It should be a position where, provided you've done the legwork, provided it's part and parcel of a far deeper, richer approach to this debate, you should be proudly talking about it and encouraging others to follow the same. So there's two sides to this coin. Don't just simply go off and spend $1,000 on an offsetting scheme and then loosely announce it. That's recklessness. That's one of those areas that we want to avoid. Instead, take the time, invest in a proper plan that looks at reuse and reduction as well. And there are plenty of areas, gold standard offsetting schemes that you should be able to invest in and then proudly communicate that so that others can follow your example. Eco-consumerism is in a very strange place right now. We have heard an awful lot about how magnificent, and rightly so, the Blue Planet documentary was into highlighting the issue with plastics in our society. The problem is that the consumers' reaction, the general public's reaction, was to buy 87 bamboo cups per person. And that is a problem. You are not going to consume your way out of this. This is an issue that we have to start getting under the skin of. And I worry that there's going to be more PR campaigns, more comms campaigns focused around releasing more and more different weird and wonderful products that, you know, use a slightly different substrate to plastic that still can't be recycled in the same way. We have this issue facing us now where we think that the answer is to weave bamboo into everything, and it is not. There was a study done back in 2012 that looked at the footprint between a green consumer and a brown consumer, as they're referred to in this study. A brown consumer being someone who doesn't really take eco-credentials into account when they're looking at purchasing products, and their footprint is the same. Their carbon footprint is the same, because the only difference happens when the consumption goes down. So if consumption remains static, you're just buying slightly more eco-friendly products, your footprint is largely the same. And this is an important thing to note. So when you are thinking and talking with your brands or your businesses or your organizations about what should we release, what product could we create in a more eco-friendly way, look at the supply chain first before you even look at the product. Look at reducing carbon elsewhere in that. But don't think that by releasing a bamboo hoodie, you are saving the world. You are not. And it's important to start understanding that. This other notion that I'm struggling with is this idea that big business is bad. As we all know, or we may not know, you know, Don't Cry Wolf is a B Corp, proudly certified B Corp. We're not one of the first, by the way. There were a few PR agencies. Greenhouse, I think, was one of the first. Greenhouse PR. To become a B Corp certified agency. Now, this is a really interesting area because B Corps are sort of seen as this sort of altruistic kind of giving organization. Well, we're not. We make profit. Otherwise, we'd be a charity or some sort of social enterprise. And there's nothing wrong with making a profit. The whole premise of something like the Green New Deal, which I urge everyone to understand and to investigate, has this very clear identity that profit's okay. It's actually needed in order to increase wealth around the wider population and to pay for things like, you know, healthcare and education and things such as that. So this notion that big business is bad, that we should shy away from this, is nonsense. The energy sector in the UK accounted for the largest drop in emissions in 2019. Yeah, we are not going to do this unless BP and Shell change. So shunning them out and giving them the kind of the sharp elbow is not good enough, guys. Because I can tell you, I love these guys, but Patagonia's influence on the carbon footprint of the planet is a drop in the ocean compared to BP's. And we really need to start getting sensible about this discussion. We need to be working alongside big business and big industry in order to make the step change, not pointing at them and saying, you guys are bad, we're the good ones. The final thing is around this idea that ESG is costly. And you see this on different sides of the camp, but you do see it predominantly coming from, I suppose, people who are slightly skeptical about the need for carbon reduction. There's no doubt about it. There will be some change and there'll be some costs associated with systemic change. But actually, there's a fantastic, and I urge you to again read around the Green New Deal, and Pettifor is a tremendous economist who's kind of written a book around this idea of the Green New Deal. And this is the sort of the movement of the entire economy towards a more sustainable and approachable future. one which actually has an equality embedded in it and a fairer distribution of wealth, as well as economic growth as well. But if you want some hard stats, I mean, and to work out whether all of this sort of carbon reduction stuff is kind of a wildly exaggerated sort of nirvana because of the costs. Well, ESG stocks outperformed the market last year. So even from the sort of the hardline financial leaders of our world, they're investing into this sort of renewable energy, clean water, sustainable stocks, if you like, this ESG stocks, outperforming the market last year. And Scotland is doing an extraordinary job in this area. I believe their carbon emissions, since they announced this focus on becoming sort of a net zero economy, dropped by around 40% in 2019, or had to have overall accumulated a 40% drop. And their economy has gone up by about a percentage point. And in fact, their economy last year outperformed the rest of the UK, whilst their carbon emissions still dropped. So this is on our doorstep. And actually, I think it's really important to understand that there is stuff, you don't have to go into the wider world to start looking at this. There's stuff happening every day on our doorstep in the UK that gives us an opportunity to learn and to share success. And Scotland is one of the most fundamental success stories in terms of decarbonising economy while still maintaining growth. I urge you to take a look at that. Okay, very, very quickly, because I'm running out. I'm sorry. I've banged on for a while. So 5 things to do differently today. Number 1, get informed. Like, just, subscribe to Nature, read journals, investigate claims, and be in the pulse of progress, and go deeper than just shiny campaigns. You need to understand this shit if we're going to get it right. Number 2, think personal. Personal, relatable stories and local causes are a key route into impacting the mindset and behaviour of the public. Take a look at peatlands in Scotland before you start looking at rainforest in Brazil, because I can assure you, restoration and peatlands on our doorstep is as important to making sure that we are decarbonising our atmosphere and making sure that carbon dioxide is not released into the atmosphere than just looking at which rainforest shall I sponsor, because that has a better PR story behind it. Also, do take a look at the personal impact of personal stories in changing people's perception around the climate crisis. There's a fantastic study being done by Yale consistently looking into the impact of communications on the climate crisis. And when they have looked at personal stories versus macroeconomic stories, it's the personal stories. It's the farmer turned sort of complete renewable energy nut on the doorsteps of the local community that have had the greater impact. Work with trusted sources as well. I mean, this sounds noddy, but I worry about the amount of times that the budget line item on a PR campaign gets reduced and reduced and reduced, and it's like, well, we've just got $2,000 left to work with an offsetting company. Well, sorry guys, but you're going to end up with a shitty one, and one that doesn't have the legitimacy behind it. So work with trusted sources and invest in them. They know what they're talking about if you don't, at the very least, and learn from them. There's a link there to the gold standard offsetting schemes if you want to go and have a look at those. Transparency kills fear. So what I want to make sure happens is that we are moving forward with positivity, with a great deal of focus on sharing the success stories and taking positive action and being a touch vulnerable doing so. But if you're sharing the results every step of the way, you are untouchable, because you're doing so much more than everyone else out there. So if you are launching a campaign or a perspective or a position internally around the climate crisis or around some form of decarbonisation approach, or looking at how you can make your organisation more sustainable, then do so with confidence, and get that confidence by saying you will transparently report no matter what. And the final bit in all of this is don't assume knowledge. So there is a lot of stuff out there, and there is a lot of misinformation, as we've discussed. It's about influencing change at a behavioural level, as well as pulling on different scientific sources to try and prove your point. And I think one of this was quite really interestingly sort of encapsulated. Pope Francis, when he finally acknowledged that there was a sort of climate crisis and that was potentially an existential threat for humanity, accounted for a 4% increase in Americans believing climate change was real. This is not a sort of scientist or someone who was sort of getting at the peak of environmental science, but this is someone who's culturally relevant, behaviorally relevant to individuals. And there's an emotional part to play in this as well. So yes, make sure you're looking for local sources. Yes, absolutely focus in on making sure that you're partnering with the right sorts of organizations and you're getting that proof sorted, but don't neglect the behavioral part in all of this and the cultural change that also needs to take place. That's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, John. 40 minutes of absolute gold there and so much to pick at. I think we're going to open up now for questions. So anybody want to ask John a question about his deck or anything related to it and what we can do as communicators?
Oh dear, I've blown you
I've got a question for you, John.
Thanks, Lindsay.
That was brilliant. Wow. So I work in agriculture. I work for one of the world's biggest privately owned animal health businesses. Everything that we do is working to improve the health and performance of animals, people, and our whole underpinning value is in creating a planet of plenty. Mm-hmm. We honestly believe that a world of abundance is achievable, but that will take us all working together. So coming back to the point that you've just made about working in unison, we as a big company in ag recognise that that's what we have to do. Everything that we do is led by science and technology, and just two things that I wanted to sort of pick up on was, number one, it's all about what you've just said, transparency kills fear. Agriculture, and I'm not going to get into the debate here about, meat-based protein, plant-based protein, that's not for here. But agriculture does have some good, real, true stories to tell. As an industry, I don't think we're very good at doing that, and we're getting better. But coming back to, it's about misinformation, and it's about, I guess, amplifying your voice. We have to somehow de-escalate the tension in the food system, because there is a place for livestock, there is a place for meat-based and protein and dairy, as there is a place for plant-based proteins. So what would your comments be on kind of trying to de-escalate that tension? It's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's about, can those two different sort of food systems work together? Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
It's a tremendous question, ignoring the sort of the kind of the furious, usually very, very misinformed debate that takes place around this. What I believe is the core issue is that both sides of the debate, if you like, the first thing they think of is, how do we protect our people around that? How do we protect the profit that's taking place on both sides of this? Okay, rather than, okay, it needs one side, one part of this debate to become vulnerable. That's what needs to take place, which is, do you know what? There are problems. And that's one thing which doesn't get highlighted enough, which is, we know that there are issues, whether it's in highly intensive agriculture, or on the other side of the scale, whether it's actually in the huge amount of food waste that's taking place as a result of the spark in vegan food. Now, both sides of the debate have an awful lot to kind of get right, as well as an awful lot to contribute. And what we don't see is the acknowledgement from one side or the other as to the issues that are involved. What we tend to see is a big spotlight on, yes, but there's wild grazing lands that have been kind of we turned intensive farms over in a part of North Wales into wild grazing lands that's absolutely working in unison with the wider community, and we've created all these jobs. That's fantastic. But first, I think what needs to happen is a acknowledgement of what we need to get, what's going wrong first. A kind of an understanding that, yes, there are problems here, and here. We're doing great stuff over there, but actually there's an issue for us to solve. How do we solve this together? And neither side is doing that on any of these debates, whether it's the energy debate, agriculture, whatever it might be. I genuinely believe that there is that, that need for one side to be vulnerable, and neither one is showing vulnerability yet. And that is causing heated, escalated vitriol rather than productive action.
John, it sounds like, especially with your mention of conscious uncoupling before, that you should be a marriage counsellor, quite frankly. We need a vulnerable party here. And you know what, you're quite right. Nobody can talk to each other. I'm a big meat eater. We have a vegetarian in the family. I still grit my teeth every evening when I have to do another meal. But you know what, that just shows you on a very small scale how big the issue is, because if in a small household, that could be the case, it just multiplies.
Also, I get concerned about extremes. I really do get concerned about extremes. You know, that balance needs to be brought into this topic as well. You know, and an acknowledgement that you're not just dealing with a steak or a piece of broccoli. You're dealing with livelihoods on both sides. You're dealing with communities on both sides, industries that have been around for centuries, thousands of years, that have been built, and that all kind of falls apart the minute you say, well, yeah, it's steak or broccoli. And, you know, I watched one Netflix film and therefore I'm informed. That is a problem that we need to counter.
Yeah. And
we need to counter it with a bit of vulnerability, some real healthy conflict around the table, and then some positive action on both sides. I would love to see the vegan community working with the intensive agricultural community more.
There needs to be a safe space, isn't there? We've got another great question, John, just while we're on. Claire Plabla has said, how much real damage do you think Trump's exit of the Paris Agreement has done in terms of keeping all countries on course in the long term with plans?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, so firstly, I mean, just sort of from fact base, US wasn't doing great anyways in terms of meeting its Paris climate commitments. I think it had a less than 10% chance right now of meeting its commitment before. I mean, this is before Trump came into power, and conversely, you know, China has 16% chance of meeting its commitments. You always hear the sort of, again, the huge rhetoric against China. Well, actually, that country invests more into renewable energy than any other country in the planet. So, you know, there's different takes to this debate. I think. What you will see, and what I've seen in the evidence is, and again, I urge you to take a look at the Yale study, which is one of the links in my presentation, is that actually the behaviour and the thought process of US citizens is leaning more towards believing that there's a crisis, and that crisis is having a negative effect on humanity in the United States. I think for all the big walkout, the big sort of display and the walkout of Trump leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, I would, whilst I think that was a dreadful move, I would suggest that we also sort of take hope in the fact that Biden is probably our greatest hope of implementing a Green New Deal and a sustainable economy in one of the, obviously, the largest economy in the world. So I think on a sort of, how much of a blip has that had? The US wasn't doing great anyways, and actually until this current kind of, it might have put us back by a couple of years. But in terms of behavioural change, when you've got wildfires raging and you've got seriously damaging local issues affecting the US population, their behaviour is leaning more towards, actually, this is something which we believe is a problem now.
Okay, here's a question for you, John, from me. COP26, what's your ambitions for it, and what are your hopes for what will come out of it?
I mean, very humbly, I expect to be offered the presidency for COP27. I mean, that's my ambition for it. And then, you know, we'll go on to like simple things like a knighthood and, you know, something like that. No, genuinely, the ambition is just, I think it's actually the worry I have of us not having a presence than it is of us having a presence. I think if we as communications professionals are not present at a global summit, talk about the climate crisis from the point of knowledge that we have, which is around how people communicate, share facts and information, then we're doing each other and the wider world a disservice. So my only objective there is to be present, to contribute to something meaningful to the discussion, and to hopefully take the collective intelligence and extraordinary ability that exists within our industry to point people in the direction of positive steps that they can take to either reduce misinformation, critically assess it, and to try and kind of at least provide a platform for this change to take place.
John, are you okay for me to share a link to your lovely presentation?
Yeah, of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I hope it's a read only. Don't start changing it.
I can do that in an email post event as well. I'm happy to share the survey link, the link to the deck, and just a few additional bits and pieces so that everybody's got everything in one place.
I think I'll ping a PDF round as well for everyone, so that there's something there.
Fantastic. Any final questions?
Hi, yes, I have a question. Firstly, thank you so much, John. That was so inspiring and really provoking, and yeah, I think really important issues for us all to think about as comms advisors.
Thank you.
I really resonated with the stuff you said about big business and the role that big business has to play. And I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on the limits we have as comms advisors, particularly in a big business, when it comes to making sure that what's communicated is accurate and transparent and followed up on? I think to myself, I work in the energy industry as well with big businesses, and I work on a contract basis. So I may consult on a project, but my influence is limited to that. And beyond that, how do we make sure that what we're communicating is credible beyond what just surface level?
I mean, it's a really it's a challenging, but I think quite sort of wholly exciting opportunity for us. So, I mean, a crass answer would be, I don't think there are limits. The limits of the amount of energy that you can invest into this, and I suppose how prepared you are to be either as irritating or as energizing as you can be in this role. Because I think where I found the most success when dealing with bigger businesses on this topic has been actually always coming at this from a perspective of positivity, and highlighting that, actually being a bit of a cheerleader for the fact that if you are working in the energy industry, actually we've got, that industry has the resources, the professional clout to do incredible things, and then saying to them, and we shouldn't be afraid, because I genuinely believe that they are. I genuinely believe that they are afraid, and that there's this rule of fear around, making a kind of movement into this area. And you just have to look at what happened when the sort of the BP chairship shifted, and there was a big statement made around sustainability, and it was just met with complete skepticism and hatred from one side of the fence. That obviously creates a climate of fear. So I think if you're able to address those, frame what you want to push forward in a positive way, and then encourage from a position of sort of bravery and actually wanting to kind of, we have a right to shout about this, I think that gets more ears than potentially sort of always slamming them down, I suppose. Does that help?
Amazing. John, that's been fantastic. I just want to say a big thank you from everybody here.